glasses, then I won't be able to see.
Good evening, everyone. If you could take your seats, we'll get started this evening. I am the Reverend Garrett Anderson, and I am the pastor of the Liverpool Presbyterian Church, and I also serve the Presbytery of Cayuga-Syracuse as moderator. And I want to extend the Presbytery's welcome to those from her congregations that have joined us this evening, as well as folks from the larger Syracuse community. Those we're grateful that you have joined us for this event. And I also want to give a welcome to those folks who are joining us on the live stream on YouTube. We're grateful that you are with us as well. I want to give a particular thank you to our sisters and brothers here from the Pebble Hill congregation for hosting us. We appreciate the use of this space and your expertise and of getting this the technology set up. We appreciate your help here. I also want to thank Sean Mellick, who's providing security for tonight, and Dr. Greg Carey, who's going to be our presenter. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank one more person, and that is Reverend Lori Cooney, who first approached the Presbytery leadership requesting that we do some kind of teaching and address this issue of Christian nationalism. Lori is really the heart and the brains and, frankly, the muscle behind this event. So, although she did make me carry the water in. So, it's the least I could do because I haven't done much to help you. So, Christian nationalism, as we'll hear, is a danger to both our society's democratic ideals and to the true proclamation of what we profess as the good news of Christ. And as a church, we often hesitate to wade into something that smacks of politics. But this is not what we're doing here. This is not the crossing of the line of the separation of church and state. This is the intersection. This is the intersection of the values of faith and truth and love and unity. The intersection of those values with our democratic values of justice and equality and fairness. I was reminded that what Dr. Cornel West has said is that justice is what love looks like in the public sphere. So I would like to invite Reverend Lori Cooney to come up and give an introduction and a little direction for our evening together. Lori? And I think we should clap for Lori.
Good evening. Just a couple of housekeeping items before I introduce Dr. Carey. Please silence your phones. There is water at the entrance because we are all well aware of the smoke in the air, and we thought that if you wanted that, so please feel free to get that at any time. And finally, Greg has provided a bibliography that can be found on the music stand just as you leave. So if you didn't pick one up on your way in, please pick one up on your way out. For those who are live streaming with us, shoot me an email. I think my email was on the flyer, so you probably have that. And finally, there will be a time of questions and answers or Q&A at the end, so keep track of any questions that you might have for Dr. Carey. Finally, it is my honor and privilege to present Dr. Greg Carey. Dr. Carey's CV is lengthy and distinguished, but here are a few highlights. Greg received his PhD from Vanderbilt University and has been on the faculty of Lancaster Theological Seminary since 1999, where he serves as a New Testament scholar, teaching a wide variety of courses, including New Testament, biblical and contextual interpretation, along with a doctoral seminar devoted to research methodologies. His elective courses include Luke and Acts, the parables of Jesus, and Romans. I will also add here that Greg was my New Testament professor, where I took many of his classes, including 2 extra semesters of reading biblical Greek. Let's just say that Greg was gracious. Dr. Carey is the author of numerous books, including Using Our Outside Voice, Public Biblical Interpretation, and Stories Jesus Told, How to Read a Parable. Along with his most recent book, which was just published a few months ago to great acclaim, it is titled Death, the End of History and Beyond, Eschatology in the Bible. Greg has served on the editorial boards of Review of Biblical Literature, Horizon in Biblical Theology and Biblical Interpretation, and has held national and international leadership positions in the Society of Biblical Literature. He has appeared on the BBC, PBS, the Discovery Channel, and the History Channel, and has frequently contributed to the Christian Century and numerous other public outlets. Greg is frequently invited to speak on ancient apocalyptic literature, sexual ethics, and the use of the Bible in moral reflection. I could go on with many, many more accomplishments of Dr. Carey. However, I would like to get to Greg's presentation on Christian nationalism, why it's dangerous for democracy and the gospel. Please welcome me in welcoming Dr. Greg Carey.
It's an honor to receive that invitation from Lori. I tell our students, take ownership of your own education, don't let us do it to you. And I can tell you that Lori Cooney is a graduate who took ownership of her own education, and it shows. It's an honor to see all of you tonight and to talk about a subject that I'm even uncomfortable talking about, in the sense that it is real close to that line. Well, it's in there. Politics and faith. So I'm mindful of that, and for that reason, I think it's all the more appropriate, as it's always appropriate, as we gather to pause for a moment of prayer. May we pray. Our prayer, O God, is to become the people you call us to be, warm and pliable in heart, agile in our minds, quick to love and act. We pray that you would grant us a spirit of humility and openness, a commitment to the truth, a willingness to look critically at our own selves and our society, all the kinds of things you form us to be as your people who gather in worship and service. So we offer this time to you, seeking your glory and the welfare of our society and our world. For Christ's sake, amen. Just a few words about how the presentation will go. I'm aware that I asked for quite a bit of time, and you may not know this, but in academics, we don't lecture much anymore. Students don't put up with it. I'm going to talk a lot for a while. So I'm just warning you about that. I'll be conscious not to waste your time so that we can talk together, but there is a lot that I want to share. I'm going to be honest, and that means that you can't talk about a subject like that at times without coming across as partisan. I'm not here for partisan reasons, but I want to be transparent with you. You won't have to guess what I think about some things from the presentation, because it's necessary to be honest and direct. I'll also say one other introductory thing and then start to hop in. I'm not an expert in Christian nationalism. I'm a New Testament scholar. I have always followed American religion as a research field, but I'm not a contributor to it. It's simply that I've become alarmed over a long period of time, over more than 10 years, about what looked to me like an attempt to shape our society in the likeness of one particular stream of Christianity. And in ways that made me realize, well, that's a threat to the gospel as I understand it, and it's a threat to democracy as I've been raised to enjoy it. And so that's why I started about a year ago around Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I live and work, talking about Christian nationalism and finding out that, well, last year it was really my part-time job for a while. And so it's an honor to come see you. I just want to be transparent that I'm not one of the people generating the research that's out there on this subject. So what to expect? I'll begin by trying to define what Christian nationalism is. I find that many people these days have heard and read about it, some by now, but maybe not in a way that helps us say, well, I think I have a handle on what we're talking about. A little bit of history. Where does it come from? How did we get to this point? How does it work? Like, if you participate in Christian nationalist life, whether in church or in other settings, how does that play? How does it work? What is it done and what is it doing? And then how do I think Christians should respond? So I'm going to begin dry with two ways of defining Christian nationalism. One is academic. Christian nationalists believe that the United States has a special relationship with God. And that relationship involves both favor, that is, that God has special blessings for this country, and vocation, that God has called the United States to be a city set on a hill, for example, a distinctive witness to God's ways in the world. As following that idea, Christian nationalists believe that the United States should declare itself openly as a historically Christian nation, declare its Christian identity in the world. And third, that the United States should then govern itself according to a specific interpretation of Christian principles. Notice that wording is kind of careful. A specific interpretation of Christian principles. Because, as you know, we Christians don't always think alike about everything. But Christian nationalists will say that they represent the Christian worldview or the biblical worldview and want to claim that space in society. Those are sort of the distinguishing features of what marks Christian nationalism, and sociologists, political scientists, and scholars of religion have found ways to survey folks' opinions on various issues, and I'll talk about that more, and begin to identify how do we recognize people who adhere to Christian nationalism, whether they know it or not, or whether they use that language. That's sort of the technical academic definition. A more functional definition would be, notice I'm adding a word here, white Christian nationalism is an attempt to baptize a narrow political agenda and call it Christian. It's a movement that is way prevailingly white, and its political agenda is distinctive within the flow of the United States. Often, many of us would call extreme, and I mean extreme in the sense of on the extreme, an extreme end of public opinion. And to say that this agenda is representative of Christianity. So this fusion of a particular politics with a particular expression of Christian faith. I came across a picture of this billboard. Every tongue will confess Jesus is Lord, even the Democrats, with a little pitchfork. Right? So a particular stream of politics identified with Jesus. We've seen it in the words of some public figures, and I'll say just a little bit about the use of slides in the presentation. I hope you're not a note taker. The slides are often there just to give you a picture or a quotation that I'll be talking about, and there's a part of the presentation where I move through them so fast you wouldn't be able to keep up because I'm just making points. They're there just to keep our attention focused. But lately, we've been seeing a lot of Michael Flynn, a retired general who was national security advisor to Donald Trump until he got into trouble for lying to the FBI. And he's active in a series of public events called Reawaken America tour events, where he is a featured speaker. And on one occasion last summer, he said, if we're going to have one nation under God, which we must, we have to have one religion, one nation under God, and one religion under God. Not a minor public figure. A man named David Barton, who describes himself as a historian, he doesn't have the credentials of a historian, and at least one of his books has been pulled from the publisher because it was so inaccurate right after its publication. has described the Constitution as a God-given document based on God's Word. And if you stay out of that, you're not allowing God's Word to have the impact it needs to have in the nation. Again, a specific political agenda tied to Christian identity, meant to be placed to govern society. Now, these are a couple of examples of folks expressing a Christian nationalist outlook. Throughout, in every time I've done a presentation on Christian nationalism, and the presentation changes as the news changes. And I mean, just in the past year, I've been through 5 or 6 different versions, and this one is new. But I always come back to this one image. What does it look like when we see it? It looks like this. And let me explain what I mean. I don't know how many of you remember the specifics of this moment, but it was Washington, D.C. in 2020, and racial justice protests were happening all over the country after the murder by police of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And things were hot in Washington, and then President Donald Trump he called for the National Guard, but he gathered law enforcement and used tear gas and some force to clear a path to St. John's Episcopal Church near the White House, where he stood and held up a Bible. He had just given an address about the Black Lives Matter protest in the Rose Garden at the White House, but in this case, he simply stood with the Bible for pictures. Why do I choose this image? Well, here is the President of the United States using a church and a Bible to somehow communicate his message about a political issue of the day. Racial justice, Black Lives Matter protests, whatever language you want to use. And somehow the Bible and the church are meant to communicate his authority, not just as President of the United States, but to align that authority with the authority of Christianity, of its institution, the church, and of the Bible. That kind of alignment, right? A specific politics. He's just given a speech. These two Christian symbols, church and Bible, no need to speak. Simply an image that's shared with the society. I would say, in this case, the church and the Bible are being used as props for his political authority. And the reason I say props is that the Bishop of Washington said they didn't ask to come and we didn't want him there. So he did not have that church's endorsement. And the Bible wasn't his. He didn't have a Bible in the White House. And so they actually had a moment where they gathered like 10 or a dozen Bibles on a table, and he tried them out to see which one would work best for the photo op. That's what I mean by prop, right? When you can use Christianity to align authority with a particular political vision, that's going to motivate a certain amount of people. And so that's what's happening in Christian nationalism now. It's happening in national politics. What I'm beginning to become more aware and alarmed about is how it's playing out in local settings, where I live in school boards in particular right now, but throughout our society. And so we need to take a look at this movement, think about where it comes from and what it does and what its agenda is, and think about how should we as Christians, because it is claiming to speak for us, how should we respond to it? So a little history. I promise not to be cruel. I never know when I travel, this is a new part of New York for me, whether Alabama humor makes it here. So it didn't make it to central Pennsylvania when I moved there. In some ways, we need to be honest that Christian nationalism is in our national DNA. There have always been many Americans who have talked about our nation's Christian identity and its Christian vocation, and it's not a brand new invention. Always been a part of our history. There's a historian named Mark Knoll who wrote a book, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. Both sides in the Civil War talked about seeking God's blessing for the justness of their side and interpreted the war as God's punishment for sin in the nation. That was a common thing to say in the 1860s. It's not a new thing to talk about how the United States relates to God and to God's blessing. A historian at Messiah College in Pennsylvania named John Fia, you may have seen him on the news over the past few years, wrote a book called Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? And John is a conservative evangelical. John argues it's complicated. Was America founded as a Christian nation? It's complicated. Are we talking about the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the Pilgrims? They wanted to found a Christian society. Are we talking about Rhode Island, founded by Baptists who fled from them when they were being persecuted in Massachusetts? Are we talking about Virginia, where you had Anglicans who were really there to make money, right? Are we talking about Maryland, heavily Catholic, Pennsylvania, Quakers and Anabaptists and Lutherans and German Reformed, and somehow figuring out that they all had to do this together and be free? When we ask, was America founded as a Christian nation, it really does depend on when, where, who, right, is making these arguments. But in the period of the Great Depression and the Cold War, a new kind of Christian nationalism began to emerge. There were two great threats in the eyes of many Americans. One was, I don't know if you remember this from, for me, 11th grade history, the Red Scares. The rise of the Soviet Union, the rise of the labor movement, the rise of communism within the United States. And a fear of godless communism. Some Americans felt that Roosevelt's New Deal was essentially a way to slide down the slippery slope toward communism. And then we had the actual Cold War, where we were genuinely scared that we and the Soviets might incinerate ourselves and destroy civilization. Groups of business leaders began to organize and sponsor pastors who would talk about Christianity as the cure for godless communism. This is the period when under God became part of the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s, right? And then many of us have lived through the period of the moral majority, right? 70s, 80s, 90s. And now we're encountering a new kind of movement that I'll talk about in just a moment. Back during this period of the 50s, a movement that many of you may or may not have ever encountered, but Christian Reconstructionism began to emerge. It was on the fringes of Presbyterian life. A pastor named R.J. Rushdoony wrote The Institutes of Biblical Law, and if you're a Presbyterian, you know what that institutes language is coming from. It's a way of talking about how society should be built from a Christian point of view. He argued that Christians should exercise dominion in society. that biblical law should be established throughout the United States. And by biblical law, he means, right, if you catch people in adultery, they should be executed. If you catch people in same-sex sex, they should be instituted. He taught this. He opposed public education as godless, and really is the first great figure in the homeschooling movement. I don't want to denigrate the homeschooling movement. Many people need homeschooling for good reasons. There is a stream of homeschooling that is heavily devoted to Christian nationalism. If you look up homeschooling Christian nationalism curriculum, you'll get examples of homeschooling curricula and the ways they interpret American history. Rushdoony was a segregationist. His favorite American theologian was a guy named Charles Dabney, who was unfortunately Presbyterian. But at that time, you Northern Presbyterians weren't those Presbyterians, because he was one of the most prominent advocates for slavery and for segregation after the Civil War. That movement has been growing throughout the United States. You may or may not have ever brushed up against it. Growing up in the South, I had no idea until I visited Pennsylvania about 30 years ago. Public education has always been an interest of Christian nationalists since those days. Even in the days of the moral majority, you have Jerry Falwell saying he wished there were no public schools, but only churches were offering education where kids could learn God's ways. What I began to notice about 10, 12 years ago was a new movement within Christianity. It's older than that, but it was new to me at that point. So just a brief story. I teach at a seminary in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and one of my best friends from high school and seminary, we went to high school and seminary together, called and said he was coming to Lancaster for a Christian convention. And I thought, how do I teach here and not know this is happening? I went. There were like 5,000 people there. And for the first time, I encountered something called the New Apostolic Reformation. It's a movement within Pentecostal charismatic Christianity. Its basic distinctive thing that makes it what it is that a group of people identify as gifted by God as apostles and as prophets in this day, and that God is, through their ministries and around their ministries, revealing the truth of the moment and performing wonderful, miraculous acts. And I visited for about 30 minutes, and we had lunch. I would suggest that this movement has expanded all over the world. I encountered it just a few weeks ago, taking students on an educational trip to Ghana. It has heavily influenced our national politics. Political names you would recognize: Ted Cruz, Michelle Bachmann, Sarah Palin. And if you remember the photo ops when Donald Trump was president, there would be a good number of New Apostolic Reformation figures in the room laying hands on him for prayer. The Reawaken America tour, which is still going on, is often featuring this kind of preaching. Remember, I said one of the marks is that people are identifying as apostles and prophets, claiming that God speaks directly to and through them, and that they are in alignment with one another. In other words, they will affirm what one another says. And they do have congregations, but they also have big conventions where there is lots of stuff sold and sung and all kinds of media present, like this Reawaken America tour. One of the key teachings of this movement, something I heard that one day in Lancaster, that was the first time I really became alarmed, is they talk about how Christians are called to take dominion over the 7 mountains of culture. business, government, family, religion, media, education, and entertainment. And I began to watch YouTube videos and listen to interviews and do what I could to begin to educate myself about this movement. If, from a theological point of view, if someone tells you they're a prophet, is authority in the community's interpretation of Scripture, or is it in what they say? Are you following me? And so as a biblical scholar, I pay close attention to the way they talk about the Bible, which is often to say God has revealed to them the meaning of a passage, right? So that they have this direct insight. Recently, a conservative Christian, he certainly is a conservative evangelical Christian, David French, was talking about the movement, and he said, the role of prophecy is a very underappreciated phenomenon in this movement. It would just help me as feedback right now if to see hands, for how many of you is this news right now? I didn't know about that. Okay. Enough people that I need to say it. And that's helpful for me. Throughout the Christian nationalist movement, and especially this wave, the language of separation of church and state is described as made up, as a fraud, as a hoax, as not historically accurate, and so forth. And even if it were in place, needs to be done away with. So that's a little bit about how we got here. And it's important for me in that part to help you think about, if you think about your neighbors who may hold Christian nationalist views, to think about maybe two sets. One set would be more familiar to you from the religious right in the 90s, right? Bible-believing, traditional, you might think of Baptists, certain kinds of Pentecostals. But to also recognize there's this other stream that may be even more influential in our cultural moment, this particular stream within Pentecostal Christianity. So, how does it work? When I ask that question, what I mean is, what kinds of attitudes do we find are held by folks who identify with a Christian nationalist outlook? And I'll say just a little bit about that before I get into the content. Especially sociologists, some political scientists, some religion scholars have started looking at survey data that's been available for decades. And some have begun to formulate their own questions, but they've identified questions that they say helps to discriminate how strongly someone might adhere to a Christian nationalist outlook. For example, we should pass biblical laws. The United States should declare itself a Christian nation. Those would be two of the... And two sociologists, Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead, identified 6 of those questions. These are questions where you might say, I disagree, I somewhat disagree, I somewhat agree, I agree. And for each of those responses, gave it a score from 1 to 4, right? 1 for a little bit, disagree. Oh, that's a 0, sorry. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. And 6 times 4 is 24, and that's how they score how strongly someone might agree with Christian nationalist views. And then, like sociologists know how to do, but I don't, they correlate those responses to those people's outlooks on other social questions. I know that sounds technical. I'm not technical in that way, so it might also sound confusing. And that's all I'm going to say about it, because then I'll just start confusing myself. But let me explain what they've discovered. Christian nationalist outlooks map strongly onto measures of cultural resentment, including race, and other researchers have begun to find that there is an organizational component to Christian nationalism that we need to be aware of and take a look at. One of the sociologists I admire a great deal is Robert Jones, who founded the Public Religion Research Institute. I admire him in part because his background is a lot like mine. He grew up in Mississippi, I grew up in Alabama. He was a Southern Baptist, I was a Southern Baptist. We went to Southern Baptist seminaries before we went to graduate school. And several years ago, he published a book called The End of White Christian America. In that book, Jones documents that the number of us who are white and Christian is declining as a percentage of the population to the point that we're a minority now, and that's fairly new. And what political scientists have found all over the world is that when a group that has been the norm in a society for a long time begins to decline in their representation in that society, you begin to get civil unrest. And Jones predicted it. He didn't describe it after the fact. He said, stuff's going to happen because of this. So, in the research on the subject, I'm quoting Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead right now, who are both evangelical Christians. They found that Christian nationalism often influences Americans' opinions and behaviors in the exact opposite direction than traditional religious commitment does. I'll give you one example. Didn't it used to be the case in the United States that if refugees had a friend in Christians? Lancaster, Pennsylvania has the highest representation of refugees per capita in the United States. But in the past few years, as a result of Christian nationalist influence in our politics, Christians' attitudes toward refugees have become much more divided. That's what I mean by, or what they mean by, in the opposite direction of traditional religious commitment. They go on and argue that Christian nationalism doesn't encourage high moral standards or value self-sacrifice, peace, mercy, love, justice, and so on, nor does it necessarily encourage conforming one's religious views to those that Jesus might have. When I read this quote, I remembered Jerry Falwell Jr. saying, "I don't look to Jesus to help me understand my politics." Jones, in a more recent book, I'm going to get more detailed in a minute. These are generalizations. I'm going to try to, puts it this way. One of the most remarkable, consistent findings in contemporary public opinion data is the chasm between two groups who otherwise share both geographic proximity and a common evangelical religious orientation: black Protestants and white evangelical Protestants. What? What's he saying? If you look at public opinion data, black Protestants and white evangelicals share almost 100% their theological outlook. Ask them their opinions about guns. Ask them their opinions about government assistance. Ask them their opinions about public education. Ask them their opinions about criminal justice. Ask them their opinions about policing. White evangelicals and black Protestants are the two farthest demographic groups apart in their opinions on these issues. So it's not their theology. Jones goes farther. All white Christians are farther away from black Protestants than are white people who don't go to church by a very, very long way. This isn't a direct quote, but Jones says something real close to, the more we go to church, the more racist we become. So, for example, if you ask people about the rich and the poor, and you ask, do we demonize the wealthy too much in this country? 58% of white evangelicals are going to say yes. 11% of black Protestants are going to say yes. Two groups farthest apart. If we ask, do you agree that most poor people are poor because of circumstances beyond their control? 85% of white evangelicals would say yes. I'm sorry, 80, that's not right. 68% of black Protestants would say yes. 26% of white evangelicals. So, as these researchers began to work through these things, they began to identify, when people identify strongly with Christian nationalist beliefs about the representation of religion in our public life, our politics, and their attitudes on other things, this is where I'm going to move fast. Here are some things they found. Folks who identify strongly with Christian nationalism are more likely than other Americans to approve of authoritarian tactics like demanding people show respect for national symbols and traditions, like kneeling for the national anthem. More likely than other Americans to fear and distrust religious minorities, including Muslims, atheists, and Jewish people. More likely than others to condone police violence toward black Americans and distrust accounts of racial inequality in the criminal justice system. More likely than other Americans to believe that racial inequality is due to the personal shortcomings of minority groups. More likely to report being, quote, very uncomfortable with both interracial marriage and transracial adoption. More likely than other Americans to hold anti-immigrant views. More likely than other Americans to fear refugees. More likely than other Americans to oppose scientists and science education as in public schools. More likely than other Americans to believe that men are better suited for leadership roles, while women are better suited to care for children in the home. Finally, Samuel Perry, working with another social scientist named Philip Gorski, found white Christian nationalists, same set of questions, sincerely believe that whites and Christians are the most persecuted groups in America. And I can tell you by listening to this discourse that they are constantly being told how persecuted they are in sermons and in media, including film. So that's a little bit about the kinds of social attitudes that tend to accompany Christian nationalism. If you think about it, it wouldn't have to be that way. You could think it would be a good thing for us to live in a Christian country. You could think that and not hold all those attitudes I just described. If you did that, you'd be like a lot of black Christians in this United States. A lot of Christians in America wish we lived in a Christian nation. But when you start identifying these particular social and political outlooks, you begin to find that they're not so commonly held among Christians in our country. So what is it doing now? What's the movement doing now? Well, a preview of what I'm about to say. It intensifies animus toward outgroups. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex people, racial minorities, immigrants, people of other faith. It intensifies that. It intensifies political polarization. You remember the little devil thing under Democrats on the billboard from earlier. And it undermines democracy. There's more open talk in our society about should we do away with democracy than there has been in my lifetime. And it's largely coming from this movement. In Lancaster County, where I live, I've been trying to pay attention. In fact, I've done some interviews with school principals, superintendents, teachers, librarians, and parents in public schools. Found a lot of stuff that I don't have time to describe, but one Christian academy in Lancaster did a podcast on progressive education and its roots. In other words, what's wrong with public education and why you shouldn't send your kid to a public school. In Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, which is a small town, but members of one church that has weekly worship of about 100 are nearing a majority on the school board in this year's elections. And this is one of their campaign pieces, returning back to basics, reading, writing, arithmetic. A platform you can trust, socially conservative, fiscally conservative. Anybody notice what's left out of reading, writing, arithmetic? Science. And they have pushed to eliminate science from the curriculum. One school superintendent said, look, we teach the curriculum the Commonwealth says we have to teach. And a school board member said, no, just do what you should do and we'll handle the legal when it comes. In other words, don't teach the state curriculum and be willing to defend yourself in court. All over the country, in school boards all over the country, there's been this moral panic, right? A set of issues keeps coming up in school board meetings month after month in several school districts in Lancaster. A school superintendent who recently retired told me he retired in large part because of the pressure he was getting from Christian nationalists. Of our 16 public school districts, he knew of 4 others who had retired for the same reason in the past 2 years. These issues, are you teaching critical race theory? As a scholar, I use critical race theory. I know a lot about it. Nobody who talks about critical race theory in the political realm is describing something that actually exists, but it has generated a lot of alarm. What do we do about LGBTQ kids, their bathrooms, sports teams? Do we talk about them, or we talk about gay parents in school, and pressure to remove books from the library and from teachers' classrooms? One teacher told me that she got an email that's called her a groomer because in her classroom, middle school classroom, there was a book that had a gay character in it in the collection of books kids could read. And that made her a groomer. I'm seeing looks like you got to listen to the other side's news if you don't know what that means. Folks who speak up for LGBT students in school, or folks who talk about gay presence in schools, are often called groomers as if they are grooming children for sexual abuse. It's happening to our educators. A national organization called Moms for Liberty is very present in our county, and in the newspaper, a citizen just said, we've noticed it's every school board meeting. Same group of people coming to the school board with a different issue. Every issue seemed to be something to try to discredit the public schools. This is the report I got consistently. Every month it's something new. And when I asked superintendents, what do you think's up? They said they don't want us to be able to function. They're trying to cause chaos. Things that have come up in one school district in Lancaster County, since students are identifying as male or female or refusing to identify by gender, would the school district allow a student to identify as a tomato? Is the school putting kitty litter in the bathroom for students who believe they're cats? That rumor was in the community, that there was a kitty litter place in the bathroom. Will reading a book about rape inspire a student to become a rapist? One school district in Lancaster County passed a policy that prohibits trans girls from competing on girls' athletic teams for the school district. And I do understand that that's a difficult issue. What troubled me was that they hired the Independence Law Center in Harrisburg, which is dedicated to what they call religious liberty, which is defending Christian right politics in schools and in public life. They hired this explicitly Christian organization to handle the legal affairs of a public school district. There's been lots of reporting on Moms for Liberty trying to get at its finances and its opinions, and I don't really want to go into that, but just one example of, this is an extreme example. The examples I've just given are everyday life where I live. But this is one of those extreme examples, but I think it gets at the idea of moral panic. You may remember Amanda Gorman, the poet who read at Joe Biden's inauguration, and her inaugural poem was published as a book. And a parent in a school district got it removed from an elementary school. So I'm reading from a news account in the New York Times. The complaint against the poem lists its author as Oprah Winfrey, not Miss Gorman. In other words, the person doesn't have the book. And it says that the function of the book work is to cause confusion and indoctrinate students. So what was the offensive material? It was these lines. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet is not peace. And the norms and notions of what just isn't always justice. And yet the dawn is ours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, just unfinished. Wow, that's the best I've ever read anything. What was offensive there? What was stoking division or indoctrination? And the research is showing that Christian nationalism trends heavily anti-democratic. Whitehead and Perry looked at this question and mapped it against how strongly people identify as Christian nationalists on that scale. So the farther you move this way, the more strongly you agree with the federal government should declare the United States a Christian nation. That's the light line. The dark line is, I consider the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution to be divinely inspired. And what they wanted to map those questions up against was, how many agree that on January the 6th, outside agitators like Antifa and Black Lives Matter were mixed into the crowd and started the violence? The more strongly you are Christian nationalist, the more likely you are to think that the real problem was Antifa and Black Lives Matter. Here's one, right at the heart of democracy. Is voting a right or a privilege? And on this scale, you probably can't see it, but people who score most highly as Christian nationalists, about 52% believe that voting is a privilege and not a right. So if you think about our national politics and how many efforts are being made to make it harder to vote in parts of the country, many Christian nationalists think that's great, because voting isn't a right. That's what I mean by anti-democratic. In recent research that I only heard first last summer, Robert Jones shared that white Americans who agree that, quote, God intended America to be a promised land for European Christians are 4 times as likely as those who disagree to believe that, here's the thing, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. 43% of folks that believe God intended America as a promised land for European Christians supported political violence. Christian nationalism in this way, I've begun to realize, and not just me, I've learned from other people, is an international movement. It's been documented in Brazil with the Bolsonaro campaign. Hungary, which I'm visiting next week to learn about this stuff. The Conservative Political Action Conference met, not in the United States last year, it did meet some, but held a meeting in Hungary, which the European Parliament has declared no longer a democracy. and invited Viktor Orban to be the keynote speaker when it met in Dallas later this year. In our local newspaper just a couple of days ago in Lancaster, this is the conservative Christian nationalist paper, not the regular Christian nationalist paper. An editorial read, "While history is incredibly important and the course of Western civilization should be diligently consulted, it's possible to form a godly society without any reference to the history of the United States by simply looking to God's law word," new term for me, "and putting it into practice." And then the author says, "Uganda seems to be making a better attempt at this than we are currently." You're aware that Uganda has just passed legislation that if people are found to participate in homosexual activity, they receive a life sentence, with the death penalty in some cases, 10 years imprisonment for anyone who advocates for LGBTQ inclusion or civil rights. This is the vision in Christian nationalism. We also found out in Lancaster that Stuart Rhodes, the leader of the Oath Keepers, recently sentenced, I think, to 18 years in prison for seditious conspiracy, was supposed to be in Lancaster County on January 3rd, 2021, to organize things for January 6th. Apparently, he didn't come. Christian nationalists believe that because they're doing God's will and are authorized by God, that they don't have to resort to democratic processes to get what they're trying to get. They'll do it if it works, but they also believe that taking dominion over those 7 mountains of society is their calling. So, just a little too quickly, but in conclusion, I want to begin by saying, look, I'm worried about Christian nationalism because I believe in democracy, and I believe in inclusive democracy, where everyone has both rights and a voice. Not just a vote, but rights, protection within the society. But I'm also alarmed because it so seriously distorts the gospel that people are leaving the church because they associate all Christians with this movement. What is wrong theologically with Christian nationalism? First, and you have to do your own work on this, but I invite you to, listen a lot to Christian nationalist preaching or Christian nationalist media, and you'll find that Jesus is largely a brand. We're Christian. But do they talk about what Jesus did? Well, he fed people, he healed people, he hung out with sinners. Do they talk about what he said? Love your neighbor, love your enemy, don't seek revenge. Lord, what he had to say about wealth and the wealthy. So Jesus is really not the subject of the preaching except as he is our identity. They don't tend to what Jesus called the weightier matters of the law. Matthew 23, justice, mercy, faithfulness. They talk about dominion and not love. They have a narrow view of freedom. When they talk about religious freedom, it means they get to do what they want to do. But they don't talk about freedom the way the New Testament does. Paul says, don't use your freedom as an opportunity to elevate yourself. Use your freedom as an opportunity to serve one another. It's idolatrous to link any nation to a special blessing from God that's unique in the world, and to identify faith in Jesus with faith in a nation or a political party or an agenda. And I will add that all of us Christians have a tendency to do it. But in Christian nationalism, it's explicit. And it's a movement that claims to represent all Christians when it measurably does not. and in that way harms the witness of the church. All of these are serious theological matters because, as Whitehead and Perry show, Christian nationalism distances people from the values of Jesus. The first couple of times I talked about Christian nationalism, I ended there, and somebody said, "So, what do we do?" And I had to think about it, and I'd like to finish this part of the presentation on that note, just very simply. First, guard your soul. I'll check time, yeah. Guard your soul. Our social context right now is driven by people who get paid lots and lots and lots of money to make us feel scared and angry. I have basically stopped watching network news altogether. Every once in a while, I'll check in on network news, and sometimes I'll watch Fox News. And I will say this about Fox News: it is all about making people resentful and angry, especially at night. But I'm not real happy with CNN or MSNBC on this score. Guard your soul. Find that place that is expansive and gracious and free. Pray. Pray with other people. Worship. Receive the sacraments. Sing. Guard your soul. Being angry is not going to help. I'll add that as an academic, the native language of professors is snarkiness. Snarkiness is death in this environment. We can't fool ourselves into believing and acting like we're superior. We can't talk about those people. Guard your soul. This will sound contradictory, and stay alert. Because a lot of what's happening in our society is going under the radar. School board meetings. Who votes in school board elections? Who reads those news stories? That's why you have to guard your soul, because you have to stay alert. Whether you need to join a group of activists, whether you need to find your own news sources, whatever you need to do, the fact that almost every time I do a presentation like this, most people are surprised by more than half of it, says we need to be alert. There's no excuse now, if you share the concerns I share, for not being active. Really active. Organized. Find organizations that promote freedom and inclusion and be a part of them. In Pennsylvania, I'm a part of Power Interfaith, which is from Philadelphia basically to Harrisburg in Pennsylvania, where we advocate for things like racial justice in public school funding and economic justice in neighborhoods, because you know where all the bad stuff in a city goes, right? Where poor people live. And we try to organize and put pressure on legislators. And we've had significant progress in raising the share of state public school funds that go to poorer school districts. Whatever being active means to you, be active. Don't just sit and watch and complain about it. Don't just post on social media if you do that. Show up. And then the last thing that I want to say is treat people as people. Don't forget. I've watched people in my life over the past few years become angry, jumpy, irritable, aggressive. And sometimes I want to push back hard, and well, sometimes I do. It never helps. Have you ever won an argument about something big? Like somebody said, wow, you said something so important, I just changed my mind. I'm sorry? Rarely happens in the moment. So we have to keep our lines, if anything, to remind people that we are not devil-loving, pro-communist groomers. Listen to the discourse. It's prominent. It's not marginal. So for that, we have to treat people as people. With that, I'm finished talking at you. I understand that there are 2 microphones around, so you can, if you want, if you don't want to get up, you can call one over, but one will be closer to the front and one will be closer to the back. And what I would ask you to do, and this is where I do the professor thing, if you start to make a speech, I will say, what's your question? And if you start going on and on, I'll say, could you bring it home? Thank you.
So if you'll speak.
Thank you. I know that the Christian nationalists want to have a country that's their way of looking at religion. How do they consider people who are Buddhist, Muslim, who are not part of the Christian fold?
That's a great question. Part of the answer is a question of ownership. So from a Christian nationalist perspective, their point of view has a right to determine the shape of this society. And most of them would say, well, anyone who's outside that vision, a Buddhist, for example, can be here, but they need to know what kind of society they're in. On the extreme end, you'll hear some of them say, and Western civilization is superior. And that's out there too, and not rare. That sentiment seems to be growing, in my opinion. But the softer version would say, as long as you can live in a society that's organized that way, we're not going to make you go to church, for example. There has been some of the other, but that really is minority in that movement. Is that a helpful reply to your question? Yes. The reason for the mic is for the YouTube.
I've long believed that the Bible was meant to be a mirror for self-examination and not a club to enforce conformity of thought. And I think it's important that we study the Bible and bring it into our lives in the 21st century and not allow people to tell us what's in it without looking at it critically.
Thank you. First of all, you said without looking at it critically. And what I think you mean by that is informed by our best scholarly judgment and public opinion and rational conversation and all that. I've returned this year, in part because of this moment in our culture, to something I was converted in a Southern Baptist church, and I am grateful for that. And grateful to that church and its ministry. But they made a mistake. They told us to read the Bible. And like new converts do, I did. I read it a couple of times in high school and highlighted it, And I decided this year to go back to that practice. And, I read the Bible all the time, but it's different to just read it through. You can do anything with the Bible, But if you stop and read it all the way through, you begin to see that the Bible represents all kinds of different points of view, that often it's speaking from assumptions that we would not transport into our society these days. For example, it includes laws on if you want to marry an enslaved woman, how to do it, which doesn't include asking. How to test to see if a woman's committed adultery, but there's no test for a man. Those kinds of things. So I agree. The thing about, I guess I was too long-winded, but what I want to say about what you're asking is, folks who say that the Bible is absolutely clear and it tells us what we should do about everything, what they're really claiming is authority for their opinion, right? Because people who believe the Bible is true disagree about a million things. But what they're really trying to say is, and this is God's will, what I'm telling you. And that is a very dangerous way to use the Bible. Oh, okay. It's always tragic when you lose a microphone. I don't know if we need a moment.
For the microphone, so what? Okay, so we got a couple questions.
Well, I'm sorry, yeah.
Sure.
So I think in this region of the state, and I just got done serving a term on a school board, we might have smatterings of people coming in with these kinds of ideas, but we haven't seen any huge protests. Like maybe it sounds like you've had some where you come from, and I think maybe in different pockets around the country, it's more prevalent. How do you explain that? I guess I have an idea how to explain it, but how would you explain that?
Do you mind sharing yours? I'm not here to argue with you. I'm really curious what you think.
Well, we're just better people here, I think.
Holy cow. And moments you're not ready for. So there is no question that the way Christianity plays out in our culture has heavy regional dimensions to it. And sometimes that correlates with the denominational tradition that came in through an area, or it could be other cultural things, no question. And there are hotbeds of Christian nationalist activity in places where it's less prominent. So I can't answer your question in a way that would be responsible. It would just be my nutty thought. What I can say is, having grown up in the South, where a conservative kind of Christianity was sort of the norm, right? Baptist and not the United Church of Christ, but churches of Christ, different group, very rare up here, made up 2/3 of the population. So I grew up in a county where alcohol sales were illegal till I turned 18. There, you didn't see much Christian nationalism in this activist way, because what was there to be agitated about? They ran everything. Where it seems to me I see it is in parts of the country where you're having demographic change, and where people feel more threatened that their way of life is changing. So the one thing I would say as a Southerner is, forget about north-south as a way of describing our nation. Start thinking about city, suburb, rural. Because there are parts of the country that have gotten their rear ends kicked economically and culturally, and they feel disempowered and threatened. One example, two counties south of the one I grew up in, when I grew up you had two races, basically, black and white. Is 33% Hispanic Latinx now. That's rapid change.
I have a question.
Oh.
As we are choking on the smog and smoke from Quebec, I'd like to ask about the connection between Christian nationalism and climate change denial. For a long time, I always thought it was economically driven, but maybe there's something more at play here. I'd like to know your thoughts.
My thoughts are a little bit, that's a great question. My thoughts are a little bit informed by political science research on attitudes toward democracy. It seems that folks' threats to democracy, the desire for more authoritarian kind of politics, it used to be thought ran with economics. Now they're finding it runs with cultural resentment. And that where cultural resentment is high, democracies, Hungary, Poland, I think cultural resentment maps onto the climate change issue. Those people out there, those experts, are trying to tell us that we have to change this, this, and this, and it's going to be expensive. And how do we know they're right? It's probably all an effort to control our society. And Christian nationalism maps onto those beliefs clearly, but as we saw, it also maps onto that cultural resentment metric. And I'll say that in the stream of Christianity I first experienced, really conservative, not all evangelicals, but a lot of the evangelical world has been anti-science. I mean, that's how fundamentalism started, was a reaction to evolution, right? And so the argument that the scientists have it wrong, COVID also. I'm speculating, but I think I'm right. I don't know how that works for you as an answer to the question you're asking. Yeah.
This is a question about authoritarianism.
Yes.
It seems Jesus was buttoned against authoritarianism his entire life, and that caused his death. So I'm wondering, how does someone who take the name of Christ as their own latch onto authoritarianism as the way things should be?
These are wonderful questions. 2 parts of my answer. Best we can tell from reading the Gospels, Jesus was very critical of other authorities, but he was pretty strong on saying, do what I say. So I wouldn't say that he was against authoritarianism totally. That said, if you just have to listen to a lot of Christian nationalist TV, media, worship to realize they're not talking about what Jesus did and said much. Often they're talking about why the Torah should be normative now for our politics. That may sound like, well, where does he get off saying this? Just this week, I was asked to debate a Christian nationalist on the LGBT issue in Lancaster County. And I thought, well, maybe I can say something helpful. And then I started researching the guy and things he said. And I realized I don't want to make his platform bigger than it already is. But absolute, talking about a big part of his most recent podcast was why the laws in the Bible should be the laws now. And not one, Jesus said, blessed are the lowly. That is the discourse of the movement.
Greg, resentment is a powerful emotion. What's the spiritual cure for resentment? And maybe not the whole culture, but just in a person.
And he said, I'm not ordained. No. The spiritual cure for resentment. I think something I've become more and more convinced of. Religion is social. We experience God together. We're called to experience God together. And so it is really important for us to nurture our relationships with loving people. Just that would be the first thing I would suggest. And I will say there's more and more research indicating the danger of being alone. Like, if you're alone, you live a shorter life. I think we need to really emphasize that because there's so many forces trying to make us feel that resentment. There was a question right here.
So, we're trying to resurrect the mics, and so if you could state your question louder.
I'll repeat it.
So yeah, we're working on a miracle.
Okay.
Here, so.
I'll repeat it. I can do each one. So you used to listen to one of those Christian radio stations. Yeah. Right.
So what was interesting to me was really sophisticated.
Very sophisticated. I'm repeating.
There was some good biblical, preaching. There was some really good sermons that you could have in any mainline church.
There were good sermons.
And then you go to commercial, and then you get Christian nationalism.
You get Christian nationalism in between. Okay. Right. Okay. I'm going to say bring it home. Yes. Yes.
So if those, as expansive and inclusive as progressivism is, if you get to the point where your churches allow a valid atheism, you don't have sections like atheist best things in sliced bread, and she remains at the pulpit, you give so much red meat, because then it looks like we don't believe the gospel.
Let me see how I do.
There's lots of different, I have other aspects.
Sure. Your basic question was, we need to have some, I'll use the word boundaries, that protect the integrity of our message and our identity as Christians, in the face of really effective, sophisticated communication by Christian nationalists. I'm going to name drop. I got to spend some time a couple months ago with the anti-apartheid activist Alan Bozak. He wasn't there to see me, trust me, but he made the comment about how we think of our activism as a part-time job, as a criticism. And I realized when he said it, people who do certain kinds of evil things don't work part-time at it. The amount of energy that goes into the kind of sophisticated communication that you're giving, and it's extremely well packaged. Someone might say something like, well, if you love God, don't you want God's law to be the law for the nation? And wouldn't like 75% of us start to go, yeah. So you're right. And you're also right that I think, sorry, I'm wandering in my answer. I just had a conversation with Drew Strait, who's another biblical scholar who works on this issue, and we both agreed that one thing we need in mainline churches is more adult Sunday school. Yes, but what I mean by that is, in the stream of the church that I'm in, it's like you get confirmed, got it. Done with you. And no, we need to assume that we all need to be constantly formed in the basics of our faith, which include the stuff about what is freedom for a Christian. It is not the freedom to do whatever you want. It is freedom specifically to serve God and love your neighbor. Right? And so when somebody says, I'm here for Christian freedom or religious freedom, that sounds good. What do you mean?
Unpack the big motherhood statements.
I'm sorry?
Unpacking the big motherhood statements before you answer the question.
I think that's wonderful. So, yes.
I'm wondering if there are any indicators that the Christian nationalism has filtered into the thinking of Supreme Court justices or others in the federal judiciary. Oh boy.
You know, I think in some cases it's evident that Christian nationalism is there. But let's also think about how Christian nationalism could be packaged as a legal argument. In the stream of constitutional interpretation the majority of our Supreme Court holds, it teaches that you're supposed to adhere to the Constitution in the way it was meant for the people who wrote it at the time they wrote it. So if you follow that by saying, and lots of them were Christians, right? That is a way that Christian nationalism gets into that conversation. I've only seen one time that I fuzzily remember where I thought, ooh, that Supreme Court decision opinion sounds a lot like a claim to Christian nationalism. But it was in the context of saying that's not our national history and practice going back to the 18th century. So that's really the best I can do with that question. Question back, right back here.
First of all, I want to thank you for a very stimulating evening, and I think the fact that so many questions have come out speaks to what a good job you did. I want to segue on the last question and also perhaps add a point here. You mentioned about halfway through your talk the fact that black Christians had more in common in terms of social and political beliefs than white non-believers or unchurched, which, let's face it, is the largest growing population right now. So it occurred to me that while Christians certainly have a very important role to play in bringing out the problems of Christian nationalism, non-Christians, non-believers, unchurched may have an even more important role. And my question to you is, how can that group be enlisted with us, since we may be skeptical of each other, and I'm speaking as someone who has my feet in both worlds, actually. So how can those of us who are tonight in a church listening to a seminary professor reach out to people who share our political beliefs and our concerns about Christian nationalism, but may not share our language and theological worldview?
Wonderful. Two things I believe. One is we Christians need to give up on Christianity being a privilege in our society. What I mean is the idea that by being Christian or by being a pastor, we have authority in the society. We need to let it go. The second thing we need to do is learn to follow and learn to partner. So, for example, in racial justice work, I have learned to find out, in my area, the primary work I'm doing is with black organizers, and they are Christians. What do they think before I talk? The reason is that very often they'll be sensitive to issues of injustice or racism before I am. They'll interpret an event differently than I start to. And I saw that play out in our group Power Interfaith in Lancaster County, where we were working really hard on public education funding. And COVID happened and disrupted everything we were doing. And then George Floyd happened. And the black pastors in our group said, public education funding can wait. We need to organize about policing where we live. And to me, in that moment, the answer to that was, okay. Just okay. Now, there are times when I might hear something and disagree with it and say so. I'm not, and we've had conflict. There's a pastor in town who, when he introduced me once for one of these talks, talked about all the times we fought. But we have to become comfortable learning an agenda from other people. One more comment about that. I didn't look for the opportunity to speak on LGBT issues in the church, but it came to me in the United Church of Christ. And for years, going to churches wherever or other meetings, I thought I was doing a service for justice. Over a period of years, I started to realize that I was the one receiving the favor. From my LGBTQ brothers and sisters and others, I started learning that the way I had grown up with my masculinity didn't really wear well, wasn't sustainable. I started relating to how I relate to other people really differently, seeing myself differently in ways that have been life-giving to me. And that's one of the kinds of partnerships where I've realized that maybe I don't need to run to the front, but find my place alongside or behind. I think with the nuns and with racial ethnic minorities in this country, those of us white Christians, if we're going to use our privilege, we should use it as leverage in service of where they guide us and seek them and follow where we can.
I have a question on how to deal with siblings who are Christian nationalists. A disturbing
God bless you too.
A disturbing conversation that I had with my younger sister, who is also a Presbyterian. We got talking about LGBTQ issues, and she goes, well, the Bible, you love the person, but you hate their sin. And I just kind of took a deep breath and said, Lord, what am I supposed to say? And I said, then maybe you're a member of the wrong denomination, because we believe that marriage is defined as two people who love each other. And I left the conversation there.
The question of our political and social divisions in our country are so raw. I was born in 1965. I can barely remember some of the 60s filtering through. I don't know which was more intense, that or this. I do know that my father quit talking to me. And I don't bring up politics. It was because of stuff I write. So I know how painful it is. I think, I did say earlier, direct arguments rarely do any good. So language that I've started using, maybe I need to put that in the presentation. Language I've started using is Baptist language, testify. What do I mean by testify? I mean, go home, sit down for a minute and be quiet. What are you really, really, really committed to as a follower of Jesus? I want to live in a world where everyone has enough. I want to live in a world where everyone is safe. I want to live in a world where I am a blessing to everyone. Those aren't particularly political opinions, but they shape. So I might say to someone, you know, I can't convince you that you're wrong about this or that, but I really do love this person, and that means that I accept them. That's testifying, but it's not arguing. I'm convinced that that has at least the effect of diffusing hostility. Doesn't mean they won't get hostile, but you're doing your part. And it communicates that you're operating from values. Because over and over again, people are hearing that folks who don't share their agenda literally have no values. They're hearing they're out to destroy this country. And so simply testifying is one of the most powerful things we can do, and frankly, we've gotten not good at it. But that's my one recommendation. But the pain of what you're describing, I want to register and respect and say there's not an easy answer for that kind of thing. I know it applies to other people in the room. Yes.
I don't see the microphone.
It's coming.
Here you go. Thank you, Garrett. Get ready to ask your question. 2 semesters of studying Constitution, I will tell you this, does not make you an expert. So, but Ku Klux Klan, Christian nationalism, we believe it's dead. I can tell you that when my wife and I moved to the southern tier of New York State, there were crosses being burned up on South Mountain outside of Binghamton, and there is still an active KKK organization just floating along there. And now I'm going to switch and tell you that I was a judge for 16 years.
Oh dear, okay.
No,
I'm married a lawyer, oh dear.
Oh, okay. Some lawyers are great. And in 1988, I was one of the teachers for the Office of Court Administration on the issue of stateless people in New York State. And that's a very relevant issue. It's just a different name for we don't want the government the way it is. So I guess my point is, yeah, we've got a lot of this going on and hitting us in the face right now, but it isn't new.
It's not.
And we need to respond today. So I can't say, well, this is what we did, to the Ku Klux Klan, and we do that again.
Bring it home.
Yes, I do want to say that one of the failings of our public school and many other schools is there's about 10 minutes mention of the Constitution. And I know that the school agenda is packed full of stuff, and I don't know where they're going to put it in. But with millions of children learning nothing, there's a Declaration of Independence and there's a Constitution. Ask them what the first three words are of the Constitution. We the people. Okay, it's not the government has the power, but we've given it away.
Thank you. No, thank you. I do want to share that in preparing for this conversation, Lori set me up for a conversation with someone who shared there is Klan recruitment in this area now. And there is where I live too. I agree I agree that we need to educate kids about the Constitution, but also we have to acknowledge that, as you said, the Constitution right now is hotly debated as to what it even says and means. And the civics education that I got, which was a civics education, would be hard to imagine happening now. Thank you, I don't know. Thank you, I don't know. I see a question here. Oh, here and here. Okay. Hi.
On our way up here tonight, we were talking with our son who lives in Florida, and I told him where we were going and why. And he said, pay attention, take notes. I need to learn how to live with my next door neighbor who wears a MAGA hat.
Wow, that's humbling. This is on YouTube. I want to come back just to one point, because I think really we have time for maybe one more question. Y'all have sat for a long time. I mentioned Hungary a minute ago. I want to say a little bit about what has happened in Hungary. Hungary experienced a lot of pressure when refugees from Syria and other parts of Central Asia came into the European Union and were essentially funneled to Hungary's borders. And Hungarians felt an immediate demographic threat. Will our society be recognizable? Will we lose our society? The American intellectuals who are studying Hungary as a model of what the United States should be are talking, and I'll name one, Tucker Carlson, talks about the great replacement. That real Americans, you figure out what a real American is, are being displaced by immigrants and by social change. And so what has worked for Orban in his campaigns is saying he was defending Hungary's national identity, and then he backs it up by, and we're historically a Christian nation, and we're anti-LGBT, he goes after schools. It is not a different agenda. So, in the most recent issue of the Christian Century, there's a good article on Christian pro-democracy activists in Hungary, which I encourage you to read. But if you're not listening to those conversations, you might not know how much Hungary is in the imaginations of Christian nationalists right now. One more question, I guess?
Not so much a question, but I've been thinking, how different would our country be if anyone who ran for public office had to first pass the same test as an immigrant seeking citizenship? Because so many politicians are saying things that are just blatantly, what? You know, compared to what I learned about, you know, our civics. And so it's appalling how little understanding there is. So that's just a thought.
I guess we do have one more question. The hand went up real fast, so.
Thank you. As a person of color, I've often been puzzled when white Christian nationalists say that they're the most persecuted group in this country. So my question to you is, could you give us some examples of what they use to indicate that they are being persecuted? I'm really serious, because I don't understand, as a person of color who looks at the issues for black, brown, indigenous, Jews, LGBTQ. I mean, how are they being persecuted?
I think I can answer that a little bit. But what I have to do is say, how do they think they're being persecuted? Yeah, and that is a good question. So in that world, this was my experience, right? So you're a Christian, and maybe you're not getting drunk at the party in high school, and Maybe you're keeping your clothes on your dates. And your friends are going to be giving you a hard time about that. And you call that persecution. Or maybe, I'm describing, maybe, to up it a little bit, maybe a law requires you own a business and you're that kind of Christian. It requires you to offer birth control, even to single women. But as a Christian, you don't want to, or you're a landlord, and you have to offer equal housing opportunities to LGBT people, and you're being persecuted. But if you want a really good example of it, there's a film, I hate that you're going to give money to these people if you watch it, a film called God is Real. And it's built on that first idea. I ran across this legend when I was a child. It stuck in my mind. There's an atheist philosophy professor at the University of Southern California. Some of you are nodding, you know this? Day after day, he's mocking God and trying to convince students to be atheists. And one day he holds up a piece of chalk. See, it's an old story because there's chalk. And that was funny. And he holds up a piece of chalk and he says, if there's really a God, I could drop this piece of chalk and God could prove that God exists by causing it not to shatter when it hits the floor. But when I drop this piece of chalk, it's going to shatter when it hits the floor. And if there was really a God, God would stop it. And he drops the piece of chalk and it hits the cuff on his pants. So I told you, it's an old story. And tough crowd. And falls on the floor and nothing, right? And the professor is so embarrassed, he sprints out of the room, and then a young male athlete goes to the front and shares the gospel with the class and converts the class. Underneath that story is the idea that Christians are constantly being ridiculed for their faith in academics, in their social life, in movies, right? In TV, where the religious character is often made fun of. And that generates, I'm telling you, that in evangelical media and preaching, folks are constantly being told they're persecuted. I recommend watching that film. So, with that, I need to say, I asked for a lot of time, and just about everybody stayed, and that's an honor that you have shared that much of your time with me. I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the questions you've had to offer. And if I can be helpful in any way, I try to respond to emails and all of that, if there's anything I can do to be useful. But thank you here to Pebble Hill, and thank you to the Presbytery and to Garrett and Lori. Thank you all very much. Go with blessing.